I'll be concerned with an issue that runs through practically every area of inquiry and that has even invaded the general culture, the issue of where understanding and justification come to an end. Do they come to an end with objective principles whose validity is independent of our point of view, or do they come to an end within our point of view, individual or shared, so that ultimately even the apparently most objective and universal principles derive their validity or authority from the perspective and practice of those who follow them? My aim is to try, for certain domains of thought, to defend what I shall call a rationalist answer to this question against what I shall call a subjectivist one. The issue, in a nutshell, is whether the first person, singular or plural, is hiding at the bottom of everything we say or think. Reason, if there is such a thing, can serve as a court of appeal not only against the received opinions and habits of our community, but also against the peculiarities of our personal perspective. It is something each individual can find within himself, but at the same time it has universal authority. Reason provides, mysteriously, a way of distancing oneself from common opinion and received practices, which is not a mere elevation of individuality, not a determination to express one's idiosyncratic self rather than go along with everyone else. Whoever appeals to reason purports to discover a source of authority within himself that is not merely personal or societal, but universal, and that should also persuade others who are willing to listen to it. If this description sounds Cartesian or even Platonic, that is no accident. The topic may be ancient and well-worn, but it is fully alive today, partly because of the prevalence of various forms of what I, but not usually its proponents, would call skepticism about reason, either in general or in some of its instances. A vulgar version of this skepticism is epidemic in the weaker regions of our culture, but it receives some serious philosophical support as well. I am prompted to this inquiry partly by the ambient climate of irrationalism, but also by not really knowing what more to say after it has been rejected as incoherent. For there is a real problem about how such a thing as reason is possible. How is it possible that creatures like ourselves, supplied with the contingent capacities of a biological species whose very existence appears to be radically accidental, should have access to universally valid methods of objective thought? It is because this question seems unanswerable that sophisticated forms of subjectivism keep appearing in the philosophical literature. But I think they are no more viable than crude subjectivism. To begin with the crude kind, the relativistic qualifier for me or for us has become almost a reflex, and with some vaguely philosophical support, it is often generalized into an interpretation of most deep disagreements of belief or method as due to different frames of reference, forms of thought or practice, or forms of life, between which there is no objective way of judging, but only a contest for power. The idea that everything is constructed belongs to the same family. Since all justifications come to an end with what the people who accept them find acceptable and not in need of further justification, no conclusion, it is thought, can claim validity beyond the community whose acceptance validates it. The idea of reason, by contrast, refers to non-local and non-relative methods of justification, methods that distinguish universally legitimate from illegitimate inferences, and that aim at reaching the truth in a non-relative sense. Those methods may fail, but that is their aim, and rational justifications, even if they come to an end somewhere, cannot end with the qualifier "for me" if they are to make that claim. The essential characteristic of reasoning is its generality. If I have reasons to conclude or to believe or to want or to do something, they cannot be reasons just for me. They would have to justify anyone else doing the same in my place. This leaves open what it is for someone else to be in my place. But any claim that what is a reason for me is not a reason for someone else to draw the same conclusion must be backed up by further reasons to show that this apparent deviation from generality can be accounted for in terms that are themselves general. The generality of reasons means that they apply not only in identical circumstances, but also in relevantly similar circumstances, and that what counts as a relevant similarity or difference can be explained by reasons of the same generality. Ideally, the aim is to arrive at principles that are universal and exceptionless. To reason is to think systematically in ways anyone looking over my shoulder ought to be able to recognize as correct. It is this generality that relativists and subjectivists deny, even when they introduce a simulacrum of it in the form of a condition of consensus among a linguistic or scientific or political community. It is the wrong kind of generality, since at its outer bounds it is statistical, not rational. The worst of it is that subjectivism is not just an inconsequential intellectual flourish or badge of theoretical chic. It is used to deflect argument or to belittle the pretensions of the arguments of others. The result has been a growth in the already extreme intellectual laziness of contemporary culture and the collapse of serious argument throughout the lower reaches of the humanities and social sciences, together with a refusal to take seriously, as anything other than first-person avowals, the objective arguments of others. I am not going to address myself directly to the manifestations of this attitude, but it is there as a source of irritation in the background, though I don't seriously hope that work on the question of how reason is possible will make relativism any less fashionable. Now, many forms of relativism and subjectivism collapse into either self-contradiction or vacuity. Self-contradiction, because they end up claiming that nothing is the case, or vacuity, because they boil down to the assertion that anything we say or believe is something we say or believe. I think that all general and most restricted forms of subjectivism that do not fail in either of these ways are pretty clearly false. My own opinion is that there is such a thing or category of thought as reason, and that it applies in both theory and practice in the formation not only of beliefs, but of desires, intentions, and decisions as well. This is not to say that reason is a single thing in every case, only that certain decisive aspects of our thought about such very different matters can all be regarded as instances of it in virtue of their generality and their position in the hierarchy of justification and criticism. I shall refer to this as the rationalist position. My aim will be to see whether it can be given a plausible form. How can one reconcile the unqualified character of the results at which we aim by reasoning with the fact that it is just something we do? Every major philosopher has had something to say about this. My own sympathies are with Descartes and Frege, and I will attempt to resist the limitation of the reach of human reason, which is found in different ways in the treatments of Hume, Kant, and on a common reading, Wittgenstein. More recently, versions of it are found in Quine, Goodman, Putnam, Williams, and Rorty. These forms of subjectivism shrink from the apparently audacious pretensions of human thought and tend to collapse its content into its grounds, so that it doesn't reach as far beyond us as it appears to do. For the most part, I shall be arguing not against the positions of particular philosophers, but against a general tendency to reduce the objective pretensions of reason, one which manifests itself in many philosophical arguments, vulgar and sophisticated, and which is a constant temptation to those trying to make sense of the phenomenon. The position I oppose will be this form of subjectivism as I interpret its allure, a position which can sometimes seem the only possible account of the subject, given that we are who we are, but which I believe cannot be rendered intelligible. I shall argue that while it is certainly possible, in many cases, to discredit appeals to the objectivity of reason by showing that their true sources lie elsewhere, in wishes, prejudices, contingent and local habits, unexamined assumptions, social or linguistic conventions, involuntary human responses, and so forth, interpretations of this perspectival or parochial kind will inevitably run out sooner or later. Whether one challenges the rational credentials of a particular judgment or of a whole realm of discourse, one has to rely at some level on judgments and methods of argument which one believes are not themselves subject to the same challenge, which exemplify, even when they err, something more fundamental, and which can be corrected only by further procedures of the same kind. Yet it is obscure how that is possible. Both the existence and the non-existence of reason present problems of intelligibility. To be rational, we have to take responsibility for our thoughts while denying that they are just expressions of our point of view. The difficulty is to form a conception of ourselves that makes sense of this claim. Because of the way in which doubts about reason are raised, the issue is connected with the limits we encounter in trying to understand ourselves from the outside. Typically, in challenging an appeal to reason, not as an error of reasoning, but as a rationalization, we point out that conviction is due to some source other than argument, which there is no reason to accept, something that produces conviction in this case without justifying. In other words, we are in the mode of psychological explanation. Once we recognize the cause, we see that alternative responses would be equally eligible or perhaps superior. We can also apply this sort of criticism to particular regions of judgment of our own, which we have assumed to be based on reasoning whose validity is unqualified or universal. Sometimes we may conclude that, after all, that is not so. It is not unusual in this way to come to believe that some of our moral or political convictions are more personally or socially subjective in origin than we had thought. Whether or not it leads to revision of those convictions, it is an important form of self-awareness. However, the pursuit of self-awareness breaks down if we try to extend this kind of external psychological criticism of ourselves to the limit, which must happen if we entertain the possibility that nothing in human thought really qualifies as reason in the strong sense I wish to defend. For we are then supposed to consider the completely general possibility that there are contingent and local explanations of the sources of all our convictions, which do not provide justifications as strong as reason would provide if there were such a thing. And the question is, what kind of thought is this? It purports to be a view of ourselves from outside as creatures subject to various psychological influences and prey to certain habits. But what are we supposed to be relying on in ourselves to form that view? Suppose, to take an extreme example, we are asked to believe that our logical and mathematical and empirical reasoning manifest historically contingent and culturally local habits of thought having no wider validity than that. This appears on the one hand to be a thought about how things really are, and on the other hand to deny that we are capable of such thoughts. Any claim as radical and universal as that would have to be supported by a powerful argument. But the claim itself seems to leave us without the capacity for such arguments. Or is the judgment supposed to apply to itself? I believe that would leave us without the possibility of thinking anything at all. Claims to the effect that a type of judgment expresses a local point of view are inherently objective in intent. They suggest a picture of the true sources of those judgments, which places them in an unconditional context. The judgment of relativity or conditionality cannot be applied to the judgment of relativity itself. To put it schematically, everything is subjective must be nonsense, for it would itself have to be either subjective or objective. But it can't be objective, since in that case it would be false if true, and it can't be subjective, because then it would not rule out any objective claim, including the claim that it is objectively false. There may be some subjectivists, perhaps styling themselves as pragmatists, who present subjectivism as applying even to itself. But then it does not call for a reply, since it is just a report of what the subjectivist finds it agreeable to say. If he also invites us to join him, we need not offer any reason for declining, since he has offered us no reason to accept. Objections of this kind are as old as the hills, but they seem to require constant repetition. Hilary Putnam once remarked perceptively on the appeal which all incoherent ideas seem to have. It is usually a good strategy to ask whether a general claim about truth or meaning applies to itself. Many theories, like logical positivism, can be eliminated immediately by this test. The familiar point that relativism is self-refuting remains valid in spite of its familiarity. We cannot criticize some of our own claims of reason without employing reason at some other point to formulate and support those criticisms. This may result in shrinkage of the domain of rationally defensible judgments, but not in its disappearance. The process of subjecting our putatively rational convictions to external diagnosis and criticism inevitably leaves some form of the first-order practice of reasoning in place to govern the process. The concept of subjectivity always demands an objective framework within which the subject is located and his special perspective or set of responses described. We cannot leave the standpoint of justification completely, and it drives us to seek objective grounds. One of the most radically austere ways of making the subjective-objective division is Kant's epistemology. On the subjective side is the bulk of our forms of reasoning, including ordinary ideas of objectivity, applicable only to the world as it appears to us. On the other side is the pure idea of the Ding an sich, about whose objective nature our reason can tell us nothing, and that includes ourselves as we are in ourselves. This is the model for all theories that the world, insofar as we can know anything about it, is our world. But even this view which subjectivizes practically everything, preserves a non-subjective frame in the idea that there is a way things are in themselves and a way we are in ourselves, which, even if we can have no knowledge of them, together ultimately determine how things appear to us. I don't propose to discuss Kant's actual view. For example, I leave aside the mystery of why it should be possible to have a priori rational knowledge of the necessary properties of the phenomenal world, even if we suppose they are basically features of our own point of view due to our nature and the conditions of the possibility of human experience. But the theory provides a limiting case of the division between perspectival and non-perspectival thought, with all contentful forms of reasoning falling on the perspectival side, and nothing but a pure idea of the way things are in themselves, of which we know nothing, on the non-perspectival side. This seems to me to be too minimal an objective frame even to support the alleged phenomenal certainties of transcendental idealism. But I believe that if we separate the idea of reason from the idea that its results must carry absolute certainty, emphasizing instead its aspiration to universality, then it is possible to withhold any relativizing or subjectivizing qualification from much more of it than Kant thinks. In spite of the abandonment of certainty and other obvious differences, the conception of the authority of human reason that I want to defend is very like that of Descartes. I would explain the point of Descartes' cogito this way. It reveals a limit to the kind of self-criticism that begins when one looks at oneself from the outside and considers the way in which one's convictions might have been produced by causes which fail to justify or validate them. What is revealed in this process of progressively destructive criticism is the unavoidability of reliance on a faculty which generates and understands all the skeptical possibilities. Epistemological skepticism, like selective relativism, is not possible without implicit reliance on the capacity for rational thought. It proceeds by the rational identification of logical possibilities compatible with the evidence, between which reason does not permit us to choose. Thus, the skeptic gradually reaches a conception of himself as located in a world whose relation to him he cannot penetrate. But skepticism, which is the product of an argument, cannot be total. In the cogito, the reliance on reason is made explicit, revealing a limit to this type of doubt. The true philosophical point consists not in Descartes' conclusion that he exists, a result much more limited than he subsequently relies on, nor even in the discovery of something absolutely certain. Rather, the point is that Descartes reveals that there are some thoughts that we cannot get outside of. I think he was right, though I also think he might have upheld the principle more consistently than he did. To get outside of ourselves at all, in the way that permits some judgments to be reclassified as mere appearances, there must be others which we think straight. Eventually, this process takes us to a level of reasoning where, while it is possible to think that some of the thoughts might be mistaken, their correction can only be particular and not a general rejection of this form of thought altogether as an illusion or a set of parochial responses. Insofar as it depends on taking the external view of oneself, the discrediting of universal claims of reason as merely subjective or relative has inescapable built-in limits, since that external view does not itself admit of a still more external view, and so on ad infinitum. There are some types of thoughts which we cannot avoid simply having, which it is strictly impossible to consider merely from the outside, because they enter inevitably and directly into any process of considering ourselves from the outside, allowing us to construct the conception of a world in which, as a matter of objective fact, we and our subjective impressions are contained. And once the existence of a single thought, which we cannot get outside of, is recognized, it becomes clear that the number and variety of such thoughts may be considerable. It isn't only "I exist" that keeps bouncing back at us in response to every effort to doubt it. Though it is less obvious, I believe something similar is true of practical, including moral, reasoning. If one tries to occupy a standpoint entirely outside of it, one will fail. Having the cultural influences on our arithmetical or moral convictions pointed out to us may lead us to re-examine them, but the examination must proceed by first-order arithmetical or ethical reasoning. It cannot simply leave those domains behind, substituting cultural anthropology instead. That is, we must ask whether the proposed external explanations make it reasonable to withdraw our assent from any of these propositions or to qualify it in some way. The same thing is true whether the external standpoint is supposed to persuade us to withdraw a first-order judgment or to recognize its subjective character or the subjective character of the whole domain without changing its content. These are questions within arithmetic or ethics, questions about the arithmetical or ethical relevance of the arguments. To take some crude but familiar examples, the only response possible to the charge that a morality of individual rights is nothing but a load of bourgeois ideology or an instrument of male domination, or that the requirement to love your neighbor is really an expression of fear, hatred, and resentment of your neighbor, is to consider again, in light of these suggestions, whether the reasons for respecting individual rights or caring about others can be sustained, or whether they disguise something that is not a reason at all. This is simply a new moral question. One cannot just exit from the domain of moral reflection. It is simply there. All one can do is to proceed with it in light of whatever new historical or psychological evidence may be offered. And it's the same everywhere. Challenges to the objectivity of science can be met only by further scientific reasoning. Challenges to the objectivity of history by history, and so forth. This doesn't mean that the results are unrevisable, only that revision must proceed by a continuation of the process itself. Any subjectivist proposal must survive as an addition to our body of beliefs, in competition with those it is trying to displace. It cannot claim automatic precedence. Since it is always an attempt to view ourselves partly from outside, it will inevitably have to provide us with a reason for abandoning or reinterpreting some of the unreduced thoughts that we continue to find plausible from inside. Such a structure of rational assessment shows itself constantly in the actual procedures of our thought, in its phenomenology, so to speak. The question is, what does it mean? What should our attitude toward it be? How can we reconcile it with the recognition that we are biological specimens, fallible creatures subject to a great many influences that we may not understand, and formed by causes over many of which we have no control? What kind of self-understanding would make our capacity to think comprehensible? I believe there is no informative general answer to this question, because the authority of the most fundamental kinds of thought reveals itself only from inside each of them, and cannot be underwritten by a theory of the thinker. The primacy of self-understanding is precisely what has to be resisted. There is a kind of inequality in disputes about the unqualified authority of reason. Its attackers in one version content themselves with saying the same simple thing over and over, while its defenders have to resist with something different and more complicated for each type of application of reason. The subjectivist's all-purpose comment, applicable to anything we say or do, including any procedure of justification and criticism, is that it is ultimately the manifestation of contingent dispositions for which there is no further justification. Justification proceeds only within the practices which those dispositions support, practices that reflect the common forms of life of our culture or our species, but nothing more universal than that. This argument, whatever it may be worth, can be made about anything. It is always possible to say, after the final justification has been given, but that is only something that satisfies you, something you say with the conviction that it requires no further justification. And all that you say is merely a manifestation of the contingencies of your personal, social, and biological makeup. The end of the line is not the content of your reasoning, but rather the fact that for you, justifications come to an end here. And that is a natural fact. That's the all-purpose argument. The reply to this cannot be equally general, since sometimes the claim to a more universal objectivity can be shown to be spurious through an alternative explanation of the process. The defender of reason must therefore mount his defense in each domain of thought separately by trying to show from within a form of reasoning that its methods are inescapable and that first-order engagement with them resists displacement by an explanation of the practice in other terms that do not employ those methods. The general challenge at the meta level must be reinterpreted as a set of proposals about the subjectivity of particular forms of ostensible reasoning, so that it can be met by multiple particular responses at the ground level. Those responses must show, for the case of mathematics or ethics or natural science, that the methods internal to that form of inquiry have an authority that is essentially inexhaustible, so that their results cannot be bracketed or relativized in the way proposed. Here is a typical example of the interpretation of reason as local consensus from Richard Rorty's essay, Science as Solidarity. Quote, "We cannot find a skyhook which lifts us out of mere coherence, mere agreement, to something like correspondence with reality as it is in itself. Pragmatists would like to replace the desire for objectivity, the desire to be in touch with a reality which is more than some community with which we identify ourselves, with the desire for solidarity with that community. Such views have a self-evident air if they are not examined too closely, which may account for their greater popularity outside philosophy than in it. But if one takes them seriously, they turn out to be inconsistent with the very consensus on which they propose to ground objectivity. What human beings who form scientific or mathematical beliefs agree on is that these things are true, full stop, and would be true whether we agreed on them or not. And furthermore, that what makes that true is not just that we agree to say it. The only way to deal with such a general subjectivist slogan is to convert it into a specific substantive claim about arithmetic or physics or whatever, and see how it holds up. I believe it will usually turn out to be inconsistent with the content of statements within the discourse under review and considerably less credible than they are in a direct contest. The standard response of a subjectivist to such arguments is that he is not saying anything that conflicts with the content of ordinary mathematical or scientific or ethical judgments and arguments. Rather, he is simply explaining how they really work. Here is another passage from Rorty. I'm not making this up. What people like Kuhn, Derrida, and I believe is that it is pointless to ask whether there really are mountains or whether it is merely convenient for us to talk about mountains. We also think it is pointless to ask, for example, whether neutrinos are real entities or merely useful heuristic fictions. This is the sort of thing we mean by saying that it is pointless to ask whether reality is independent of our ways of talking about it. Given that it pays to talk about mountains, as it certainly does, one of the obvious truths about mountains is that they were here before we talked about them. If you do not believe that, you probably do not know how to play the usual language games which employ the word mountain. But the utility of those language games has nothing to do with the question of whether reality as it is in itself, apart from the way it is handy for human beings to describe it, has mountains in it. But the subjectivist can't escape so easily. The claim that there is nothing more to objectivity than solidarity with your speech community, even if it is extended to the things your speech community says would be true whether they said so or not, directly contradicts the categorical statements it purports to be about. That there are infinitely many prime numbers, that racial discrimination is unjust, that water is a compound, that Napoleon was less than 6 feet tall. The contradiction comes from adding a qualification that is incompatible with the unqualified nature of the original. The strongest objection to these ideas is the most obvious. The subjectivist may insist that he is not denying any of the following commonplaces, but he cannot really give a sensible account of them. 1, there are many truths about the world that we will never know and have no way of finding out. 2, some of our beliefs are false and will never be discovered to be so. 3, if a belief is true, it would be true even if no one believed it. Simply to say that such statements are part of the language game with which we seek solidarity does not render them intelligible. These forms of subjectivism are radical positive claims, and not, as their proponents represent them, merely the rejection of metaphysical excesses. To take such a claim seriously, one has to try to interpret it as a genuine alternative, something we are being asked to believe about our relation to the world. And then it will inevitably engage the mechanisms of rational assessment. Such a proposal cannot be exempted from the requirements of intelligibility and credibility. It is a statement, after all, and supposed to be true. How else can we decide whether to accept it but by thinking about it? In most cases, we will then conclude that reason and objectivity are not grounded in consensus, but on the contrary, that where consensus is available, it arises from the convergence among different individuals, all reasoning to get at the truth. There is a consensus on the non-denumerability of the real numbers because the demonstration of it is conclusive, and not vice versa. However much one may try to construe one's concepts and thoughts naturalistically, as the expression of contingent forms of life, the logic of the effort will always generate thoughts too fundamental for this, thoughts which one cannot get outside of in this way, and which one must employ in trying to view from the outside anything else that one does. These thoughts cannot in any way be given a first-person interpretation or qualification. They bob to the surface again in their unqualified form whenever we try to subordinate them to psychology, sociology, or natural history. I don't mean that they all have irreversible finality. Sometimes they are refuted or displaced by superior reasons, but they form an outer boundary whose interest is non-relative. There is a further general response that I want to mention at this point, one which haunts all rationalist and realist philosophies. The question may now be asked, even granting your description of how we think, why doesn't that show only that we cannot say that logic, for example, or ethics, is rooted in our natural, unquestioned practices, but this nevertheless shows itself in the way in which arguments and justifications come to an end, in judgments on which we naturally agree? We cannot say that logic depends on such practices because that would itself violate those practices, in which logic itself has the last word. But doesn't the ultimate authority of those practices show itself in the fact that this last word is the last word in our arguments, our thoughts, our reasonings? This proposal derives, of course, from Wittgenstein's doctrine in the Tractatus that the truth of solipsism cannot be stated, but nevertheless shows itself in the fact that however impersonally I describe the world, it is still described in my language. I cannot truly say in this language that the world is my world, because in my language that is false. The world existed before I did, and would have existed even if I had never been born, for example. But all this is being said in my language, and that shows that in a deeper way, the world is my world, even though it cannot be said. Why is this not an appropriate comment on my claim that logical, arithmetical, and even ethical thoughts are devoid of any first-person element and admit of no first-person qualification? Why not say that there being expressions of our most deep-seated responses, practices, or habits shows itself in the actual process of reasoning, though it cannot be said? I wish it were enough to reply, as Frank Ramsey is said to have done to Wittgenstein, what can't be said, and it can't be whistled either. But I want to reply more strongly that the truth of solipsism is not shown by the fact that the language in which I describe the world is my language, and the truth of some other form of subjectivism is not shown by the fact that justification comes to an end at certain points at which there is natural agreement in judgments. Nothing about the framework of thought is shown by these facts, because the thoughts themselves dominate them. Everything depends on the outcome of this peculiar contest over the last word. The subjectivist wants to give it to the recognition that justifications come to an end within our language and our practices. I want to give it to the justifications themselves, including some that are involved or implicated in that recognition, which is subordinate to them, just as the recognition that a notation is essential for thinking about arithmetic is subordinate to arithmetic itself. A certain extra step that some people try to take offers only the illusion of a thought. There is no thought there. That path leads nowhere. When one adds, this is simply what I do, or this is my form of life, or this is what I happen to care about, to what is in itself not a first-person statement, one adds nothing, not even something that can be shown but not said. That this is so can be seen from the fact that one can add such an empty qualifier to absolutely everything, anything. If there were non-subjective thoughts, someone would still have to think them. So the formula that simply notes this cannot be used to demonstrate that everything is based on our responses. A tautology with which all parties to a dispute must agree cannot show that one of them is right. It is hard to be satisfied with giving the last word to certain ordinary statements or forms of reasoning. If one rejects all relativizing qualifications, it is terribly tempting to add something else in their place and to say 2 + 2 = 4 and cruelty is evil, not just for us, but absolutely. But if it attempts to go beyond the denial of the qualification, this may, in the immortal words of Bernard Williams, be one thought too many, with the unfortunate implication that unless something positive can be put in that space, we will be left with subjectivism after all. It would be better if we could just come to a stop with certain kinds of judgments and arguments which neither admit nor require further qualification. But that seems to demand a level of philosophical willpower that is beyond most of us. The impulse to qualify is very difficult to suppress. The only way to resist the constant temptation to give the last word, even the unsayable last word, to the first person, singular or plural, is to see how first-order reasoning about the world inevitably dominates these ideas if we take them seriously. Thank you. The question was whether the pragmatist could say that he's not purporting to make an objective claim, but nevertheless offering reasons that he finds attractive in the expectation that perhaps others will also, since we are members of a common culture and we're all part of the same conversation, and it's just an effort to achieve this sort of solidarity. I think that that's a way in which, that's a form of pragmatism that is consistent, although it does require the refusal to claim in the ordinary sense that someone who doesn't agree is wrong or making a mistake. It really does pull back what I think to be the ordinary ambitions of reasoning to offer arguments that show that this conclusion is correct, and arguments whose validity doesn't depend on some contingent fact about the interlocutor. The phrase that you picked up was actually in answer to a hypothetical pragmatist who applied the pragmatist view to itself, and I suppose in a way you're saying that's something that can be accepted from his point of view. Well, the question was how is it necessary to maintain the rationalist position that all judgments are justified in general terms? I actually wouldn't want to say that. There are plenty of particular judgments that are simply perceptual, for example, although I wouldn't count that as reasoning. The claim about generality was that when you offer a a justification for a conclusion, or draw a conclusion from various bits of evidence, some of which may be very particular, you must be relying on principles that you think are not just expressive of your way of pulling these things together. I mean, you must think of yourself as applying standards or rules or principles or reasons that are general in some sense, that anyone else would be justified in applying in your circumstances. And I also think that the whole thing builds out to a general structure. I mean, one looks for more and more general accounts of the way in which particular facts are linked to one another. But I wouldn't say that every individual judgment, I mean, we get our world picture by combining a contribution from these two poles, the extremely particular contents of individual experience and very general principles, beginning with the principles of logic, which we use to construct a conception of a world governed by general laws, principles, and facts within which our particular experience can be coherently located. So the contribution of, for example, empirical information is indispensable. Okay, well, to repeat, it was hard to repeat, but yeah. But the main thing is, what could be the alternative to subjectivism? I mean, even I have, I mean, the point is that even I am saying there are certain things we can't help doing, we can't help having thoughts of these kinds. And furthermore, there are plenty of types of reasoning we do which are not to be described as following strict logical rules of implication. How could it be anything else but certain dispositions that we have, which no doubt have an evolutionary explanation? The trouble is what you're trying to do is to, I mean, you're offering a picture which is very seductive. You know, these contingent creatures reacting in certain ways. But what are you using in order to construct that picture? I mean, you are getting outside of yourself. You're looking down at yourself as if you were, you know, as a creature, which you are. We all are. But what you're doing is to try to place these creatures in an acceptable conception of the world. And that claim, that is the frame, is something that you cannot be thinking of as simply the manifestation of certain dispositions that you have or inabilities to think otherwise. That's not what you're doing. You're saying how things are. And that's why I think there is something, you know, self-defeating about this whole process. Simple arithmetical or logical thoughts are examples of reason, if anything is, however difficult it may be to understand exactly what is going on. And they are pervasive elements of the thought of anyone who can think at all. If we can understand how they exclude the possibility of a relativizing external view, it may help with more complicated cases. The simplest of such thoughts are immune to doubt. Whatever else we may be able to imagine as different, including this happened, let me see, maybe my shirt will provide a better, the trouble is there's something wrong with the spring. Okay, it may happen again. Whatever else we may be able to imagine as different, including the possibility that we ourselves should be incapable of thinking that 2 + 2 = 4, none of it tends to confer the slightest glimmer of possibility on that proposition's failing to be true or being true only in some qualified sense. If we are capable of thinking it at all, then it simply cannot be dislodged by any other suppositions, however extravagant. If, for example, someone says to me, "You only believe that 2 + 2 = 4 because you were in love with your second-grade arithmetic teacher," this fails to qualify as a challenge. I may call up the long-buried image of Miss Gardbaum with her soft hair, prominent bosom, and dark blue skirt powdered with chalk dust, and acknowledge that, yes, I was in love with her and wanted to believe everything she told me. But these reflections will be powerless to make me reconsider my conviction that 2 + 2 = 4, because it lies beyond their reach and does not depend on anything which they call into question. I cannot come to consider it, even temporarily, as a mere appearance. When we modify our beliefs to avoid logical contradiction, we are not merely responding to a distaste for contradictions. If I am inclined to believe P, and if P then Q, and I then become convinced that not Q, then I am constrained to give up my belief in either P or if P then Q, because the three propositions together cannot be part of the truth. If I try to think of this as being ultimately just a feature of my point of view, I will fail, because even the conception of the world as containing a host of different perspectives, mine among them, must be constrained by the principle of non-contradiction. Any relativistic frame I try to put around it will inevitably end up containing it as a non-relative feature. Or, for a more interesting example, consider Euclid's simple proof that there are infinitely many prime numbers. If we suppose that there are finitely many, we get a contradiction, since the product of all of them plus 1 will be divisible by none of them without remainder, but by each of them with a remainder of 1. It is therefore either itself prime or divisible by another prime not in the original set. There is no role here for consensus or conformity or agreement. If, when presented with this argument, someone said that the product of all the finitely many primes plus 1 would be divisible by one of them without remainder, we could only treat it as either dim-wittedness or gibberish. We can, of course, be mistaken in some of our judgments about what is and is not inconceivable. But such mistakes must be corrected at the same level at which they are made. That is, we must come to have some kind of positive understanding that we formerly lacked of how the proposition whose falsity we were unable to imagine might, after all, fail to be true. And the understanding must be in terms of the proposition itself. mere external information about how we came to believe the proposition or about circumstances in which we would have failed to believe it are not enough. We have here a clear example of one type of thought being superior in authority to others. When we juxtapose simple logical or mathematical thoughts with any other thoughts whatever, they remain subject only to their own standards and cannot be made the object of an external, purely psychological evaluation. In logic, we cannot leave the object language behind, even temporarily. We may acknowledge that we are products of biological development and environmental influence, contingently constituted beings with contingent psychologies, speaking and thinking in contingent languages with contingent notations, and formed by contingent cultures. We may acknowledge that in various respects we might have been different, and also that there might have been no creatures like us at all. But none of these thoughts can get underneath the thought that 2 + 2 = 4, or that contraposition is a valid form of implication, or that the product of any finite collection of primes plus 1 is not divisible by any of them without remainder. Or perhaps the preferable image is that none of these empirical thoughts enable us to rise above the logical thought, thinking about it while withholding commitment from its content. We cannot even momentarily bracket the ground level thought that contraposition is valid and substitute for it the purely psychological observation that we find the falsity of that proposition inconceivable. It forms part of the framework of everything we can think about ourselves. Descartes himself, in the first meditation, refuses to recognize this priority. I believe he is wrong to entertain, even temporarily, the hypothesis that an evil demon may be scrambling his mind to make him think falsely that 2 + 3 = 5, or that a square has 4 sides. That would require him to think the following. I can't decide between two possibilities. A, that I believe that 2 + 3 = 5 because it's true, or B, that I believe it only because an evil demon is manipulating my mind. In the latter case, my belief may be false, and 2 + 3 may be 4 or 3 or something else. This thought is unintelligible for two reasons. First, it includes the thought that perhaps 2 + 3 = 4, which has not been given a sense and cannot acquire one by being conjoined with the extraneous, non-arithmetical thought that an evil demon might be manipulating his mind. Second, the judgment that there are two such mutually exclusive alternatives and that he has no basis for deciding between them is itself an exercise of reason. And by engaging in it, Descartes has already implicitly displayed his unshakable attachment to first-order logical thought, undisturbed by the possibility that his mind is being manipulated. In other words, he can't even consider the implications of that possibility without implicitly ruling it out. Descartes also held that God could have made the eternal truths of arithmetic different, could have made 2 + 3 = 4, I suppose. But this is unintelligible for the same reason. He rests the weight of this possibility on his greater confidence in the idea of God's omnipotence and responsibility for everything than in his judgments of mathematical inconceivability. Here's a quotation from the sixth set of replies, or his reply to the sixth set of replies to the Meditations. Quote, "Again, there is no need to ask how God could have brought it about from eternity that it was not true that twice 4 make 8, and so on. For I admit this to be unintelligible to us. Yet, on the other hand, I do understand quite correctly that there cannot be any class of entity that does not depend on God. I also understand that it would have been easy for God to ordain certain things such that we men cannot understand the possibility of their being otherwise than they are. And therefore, it would be irrational for us to doubt what we do understand correctly just because there is something which we do not understand and which, so far as we can see, there is no reason why we should understand. This implies a hierarchy among a priori judgments that is unpersuasive. The idea is that if we believe G for God, and G provides an explanation of why I would seem to us inconceivable, even if it really wasn't impossible, then it is reasonable to regard I as possible, though we cannot conceive how. This makes sense as a general account of how we can come to distrust a modal intuition. The trouble is that in this case, the inconceivability of I is so unshakable that, by contraposition, it undermines confidence in G. It is impossible to believe that God is responsible for the truths of arithmetic if that implies that it could have been false that twice 4 is 8. And it won't help to add that God could also have made contraposition invalid. This argument of Descartes is in structure precisely the same as is offered by those who want to ground logic in psychology or forms of life, and the same thing is wrong with it. However reasonable it may be to entertain doubts as to the validity of some of what one does under the heading of reasoning, such doubts cannot avoid involving some form of reasoning themselves, and the priorities I have been talking about show up in what we fall back on as we try to distance ourselves from more and more thoughts. Strategically, I think Descartes was right about this aspect of the appropriate response to skepticism, even if he was much too expansive about the range of things about which we could suspend belief. Certain forms of thought can't be intelligibly doubted because they force themselves into every attempt to think about anything. Every hypothesis is a hypothesis about how things are and comes with logic built into it. The same is true of every doubt or counterproposal. To dislodge a belief requires argument, and the argument has to show that some incompatible alternative is at least as plausible. Thought itself has priority over its description, because its description necessarily involves thought. The use of language has priority over its analysis, because the analysis of language necessarily involves its use. And in general, every external view of ourselves, every understanding of the contingency of our makeup and our responses as creatures in the world has to be rooted in immediate first-order thought about the world. The subjectivist would no doubt reply that he can avoid offending against common sense, since he is merely analyzing what we ordinarily say, not recommending that we change it. So, for example, he can agree that contraposition would be valid even if we didn't think it was, because this simply follows from its being valid. And that is something we are all prepared to say, and are therefore prepared to say is true. All of the rationalist claims to mind independence are preserved within the system of statements that the subjectivist is prepared to endorse and to interpret as expressions of our basic responses. But this reply is useless. The reason it will not work is that the subjectivist always has something further to say which does not fit into this framework, but is supposed to be a comment on the significance and ultimate basis in human practices of the whole thing. And that comment simultaneously contradicts the true content of the original statements of reason and contradicts itself by being intelligible only as an objective claim, not grounded merely in our inescapable responses. The general moral to be drawn from these observations, a moral that applies also to forms of reasoning very different from the simple self-evident principles we've been considering so far, is this: reflection about anything leads us inexorably to certain thoughts in which I plays no part, thoughts which are completely free of first-person content. This can be understood to include the first-person plural for good measure. Such impersonal thoughts are simply misrepresented by any attempt to say that the real ground of their truth or necessity is that we can't help having them, or that this is one of our fundamental and not further grounded responses or practices, to reinterpret or diagnose them in a personal or communal form. And one cannot evade the objection by admitting that such a diagnosis is not statable within the linguistic practice to which it applies, but can be seen to be right nonetheless. On the contrary, we can see that it couldn't be right. Let me now move to a slightly different topic. What seems permanently puzzling about the phenomenon of reason, and what makes it so difficult to arrive at a satisfactory attitude toward it, is the relation it establishes between the particular and the universal. If there is such a thing as reason, it is a local activity of finite creatures that somehow enables them to make contact with universal truths, often of infinite range. The temptation is always powerful to think that this is impossible, and that an interpretation of reason must be found which reduces it to something more local and finite. It therefore may be useful to reflect directly on the employment of reason that gives us our knowledge of infinity itself. The infinity of the natural numbers is something we come to grasp through our recognition that, in a sense, we cannot grasp all of it, while at the same time we see that there is something there which we cannot grasp. So we give the set a name, even though we cannot reach all of its members. Once we are able to count at all, we have the basis for realizing that every number has a successor larger by 1. This is easier if we already use a repeating notation for counting, like the decimal system, which is itself an infinite series. But someone whose numerical language was finite, like an alphabet, could come to see that every number had a successor larger by 1, even though he had names for only the first 26 of them. The idea of infinity would not arise from just any fixed sequence of symbols, such as those used to designate in order the stages of a dance or the steps that go into building a house. That would not give rise to the idea that every step has a successor. To get that idea, we need to be operating with the concept of numbers as the sizes of sets, which can have anything whatever as their elements. What we understand, then, is that the numbers we use to count things in everyday life are merely the first part of a series that never ends. This thought is a paradigm of the way reason allows us to reach vastly beyond ourselves. The local, finite practice of counting contains within itself the implication that the series is not completable by us. It has, so to speak, an inbuilt immunity to attempts at reduction. Though our direct acquaintance with and designation of specific numbers is extremely limited, we cannot make sense of it except by putting them and ourselves in the context of something larger. something whose existence is independent of our fragmentary experience of it. Yet we draw this access to infinity out of our distinctly finite ability to count, in virtue of its evident incompleteness. When we think about the finite activity of counting, we come to realize that it can only be understood as part of something infinite. The idea of reducing the apparently infinite to the finite is therefore ruled out. It is the apparently finite that must be explained in terms of the infinite. The reason this is a model for the irreducibility of reason in general is that it illustrates the way in which the application of certain concepts from inside overpowers the attempt to grasp that application from outside and to describe it as a finite and local practice. It may look small and natural from outside, but once one gets inside it, it opens out to burst the boundaries of that external naturalistic view. It is like stepping into what looks like a small windowless hut and finding oneself suddenly in the middle of a vast landscape stretching endlessly out to the horizon. And it is precisely by posing the reductive question that we come to see this. We discover infinity when we ask whether these numbers we can name are all there is, whether we can understand counting as just a finite human practice in which speakers of the language come to relatively easy agreement. From inside the practice itself comes a negative answer. The view from inside dominates the view from outside, unless the latter somehow expands to include a version of the former. It is natural to want to understand ourselves, including our capacity to reason. But our understanding of ourselves must be part of our understanding of the world of which we form a part. And that means this understanding cannot close over itself completely. We have to remain inside it, and we cannot tell a story about ourselves and our rational capacities which is incompatible with the understanding of the world to which any story about ourselves must belong. The description of ourselves, including our rational capacities, must therefore be subordinate to the description of the world that our exercise of those capacities reveals to us. In particular, the description of what happens when we count must include the relation of that activity to the infinite series of natural numbers, since that is part of what our operation with the concept of number makes evident. So counting, even small samples of it, must be understood as the application of a successor relation which generates an infinite series. Any external view of the practice which leaves this out or makes it mysterious is thereby shown to be inadequate by the standards evident from within the practice. From inside, the incompleteness of any finite sequence of natural numbers is an evident logical consequence of the concept of number. That internal view has to be in some way made part of any adequate external view. This is the general form of all failures of reduction. The perspective from inside the region of discourse or thought to be reduced shows us something that is not captured by the reducing discourse. Behavioristic reductions and their descendants do not work in the philosophy of mind because the phenomenological and intentional features that are evident from inside the mind are never adequately accounted for from the purely external perspective that the reducing theories limit themselves to, under the mistaken impression that it alone is compatible with a scientific worldview. The internal perspective of consciousness dominates any attempt to subordinate it to the external perspective of physiology and behavior. So the external account of the mind must somehow incorporate what is evident from inside it. To change the subject again slightly, while I cannot take it up properly here, I believe the issue of the objectivity of science has the same structure, as for that matter does the issue of the objectivity of ethics. The reply to a relativistic or subjectivist interpretation always has to come from within the domain under attack. That is, the relativistic interpretation must be taken seriously enough so that one can see that it fails to make sense of the procedures of reasoning which operate inside that domain, and that it is in fact overwhelmed by those procedures with which it is in competition and which transcend any first-person interpretation. Now, what is the right reply to someone who says that the acceptance of this method of forming scientific beliefs is just the expression of a particular historically contingent cultural outlook, and that the methods have no more objective authority than that? It is, of course, true that the method was developed in its present form by an intellectual community that arose in Europe in the 17th century. But that by itself does not tell us what kind of thing these people discovered or created. The right reply to the relativist is that his claim has to be understood as a claim about the world, and that as a claim about the world, it simply lacks the leverage to undermine the independent authority of the methods whose universal validity or objectivity it is trying to call into question. I believe that if we take relativism about natural science seriously, it can only be understood as a proposal to make physics a subject which is best understood from the outside, from a psychological, anthropological, or historical standpoint. And that is impossible, because whatever we may learn about the cultural surroundings of the scientific revolution, the actual content of the scientific reasoning of which it consisted remains as a freestanding structure of thought, much more powerful than the socio-historical commentary. The same can be said, of course, of debunking studies of the sociology of contemporary science. But I would even add that the same strategy has to be used in response to Kant's transcendental idealism. I will not proceed to do so, but essentially, the answer has to come from inside physical science. This will perhaps provoke the charge that I am begging the question by attacking subjectivism on precisely the grounds that it is trying to challenge. But the situation is really symmetrical. The subjectivist is, after all, proposing to add something to the ordinary statement of scientific theories, a subjective qualifier that diminishes their meaning. And when one has to decide between two alternatives, each of which can claim to be begging the question against the other, the only way to do it is to think about them. The reasons for believing the atomic theory of matter or the germ theory of disease, believing them to be simply true, are in their own right overwhelmingly more convincing than any historicist or other argument for giving them a subjectivist qualification. But this seems to leave us with a question that has no imaginable answer. How is it possible for finite and local beings like us to think infinite or universal thoughts? And even if those thoughts take priority over any possible outside view of them, what outside view can we take which is at least consistent with their content? The constant temptation toward reductionism, the explanation of reason in terms of something less fundamental, comes from treating our capacity to engage in it as the primary clue to what it is. What might be a more realistic alternative? Well, to highlight this question, here are two quotations from Reasoning and the Logic of Things by Charles Sanders Peirce, often described as the founder of pragmatism, but clearly an enemy of the view that today commonly goes by that name. Quote, "The only end of science, as such, is to learn the lesson that the universe has to teach it. In induction, it simply surrenders itself to the force of facts, but it finds that this is not enough. It is driven in desperation to call upon its inward sympathy with nature, its instinct for aid, just as we find Galileo at the dawn of modern science making his appeal to il lume naturale. The value of facts to it lies only in this, that they belong to nature, and nature is something great and beautiful and sacred and eternal and real, the object of its worship and its aspiration." End quote. And here is one especially Platonic morsel. Quote, "The soul's deeper parts can only be reached through its surface. In this way, the eternal forms that mathematics and philosophy and the other sciences make us acquainted with will, by slow percolation, gradually reach the very core of one's being and will come to influence our lives. And this they will do not because they involve truths of merely vital, he means practical, importance, but because they are ideal and eternal verities." End quote. Now, I find these declarations not only eloquent, but entirely congenial. But they have a radically anti-reductionist and realist tendency quite out of keeping with present fashion. And they are alarmingly Platonist in that they maintain that the project of pure inquiry is sustained by our inward sympathy with nature, on which we draw in forming hypotheses that can then be tested against the facts. Something similar must be true of reason itself, which, according to Peirce, has nothing to do with how we think. If we can reason, it is because our thoughts can obey the order of the logical relations among propositions. So here again, we depend on a Platonic harmony. The reason I call this view alarming is that it is hard to know what world picture to associate it with, and difficult to avoid the suspicion that the picture will be religious or quasi-religious. Rationalism has always had a more religious flavor than empiricism. Even without God, the idea of a natural sympathy between the deepest truths of nature and the deepest layers of the human mind, which can be exploited to allow gradual development of a truer and truer conception of reality, makes us more at home in the universe than is secularly comfortable. The thought that the relation between mind and the world is something fundamental makes many people in this day and age nervous. I believe this is one manifestation of a fear of religion which has large and often pernicious consequences for modern intellectual life. In speaking of the fear of religion, I don't mean to refer to the entirely reasonable hostility towards certain established religions and religious institutions in virtue of their objectionable moral doctrines, social policies, and political influence. Nor am I referring to the association of many religious beliefs with superstition and the acceptance of evident empirical falsehoods. I'm talking about something much deeper, namely the fear of religion itself. I speak from experience, being strongly subject to this fear myself. I want atheism to be true, and am made uneasy by the fact that some of the most intelligent and well-informed people I know are religious believers. It isn't just that I don't believe in God and naturally hope that I'm right in my belief. It's that I hope there is no God. I don't want there to be a God. I don't want the universe to be like that. My guess is that this cosmic authority problem is not a rare condition, and that it is responsible for much of the scientism and reductionism of our time. One of the tendencies it supports is the ludicrous overuse of evolutionary biology to explain everything about life, including everything about the human mind. Darwin enabled modern secular culture to heave a great collective sigh of relief by apparently providing a way to eliminate purpose, meaning, and design as fundamental features of the world. They become instead epiphenomena generated incidentally by a process that can be entirely explained by the operation of the non-teleological laws of physics on the material of which we and our environments are composed. There might still be thought to be a religious threat in the existence of the laws of physics themselves, and indeed the existence of anything at all, but it seems to be less alarming to most atheists. Now, this is a somewhat ridiculous situation. First of all, one should try to resist the intellectual effects of such a fear, if not the fear itself, for it is just as irrational to be influenced in one's beliefs by the hope that God does not exist as by the hope that God does exist. But having said that, I would also like to offer, somewhat inconsistently, the reassurance that atheists have no more reason to be alarmed by fundamental and irreducible mind-world relations than by fundamental and irreducible laws of physics. It is possible to accept a worldview that does not explain everything in terms of quantum field theory without necessarily believing in God. If the natural order can include universal, mathematically beautiful laws of fundamental physics of the kind we have discovered, why can't it include equally fundamental laws and constraints that we don't know anything about, that are consistent with the laws of physics, and that render intelligible the development of conscious organisms, some of which have the capacity to discover by prolonged collective effort some of the fundamental truths about that very natural order? I'm interpreting the concept of physics restrictively enough so that the laws of physics by themselves will not explain the presence of such thinking beings in the space of natural possibilities. Of course, if physics just means the most fundamental scientific theory about everything, then it will include any such laws if they exist. Now, this need not be a particularly anthropocentric view. We are simply examples of mind, and presumably only one of countless possible, if not actual, rational species on this or other planets. But the existence of mind is certainly a datum for the construction of any world picture. At the very least, its possibility must be explained. And it seems hardly credible that its appearance should be a natural accident, like the fact that there are mammals. I admit that this idea, that the capacity of the universe to generate organisms with minds capable of understanding the universe, is itself somehow a fundamental feature of the universe, has a quasi-religious ring to it, something vaguely Spinozistic. Still, it is this idea, or something like it, which Peirce seems to endorse in the passages I have quoted. And I think one can admit such an enrichment of the fundamental elements of the natural order without going over to anything that should count literally as religious belief. It is unclear what would have to be included in a more mind-friendly cosmology. Even if nature includes laws which explain the possibility of intelligent life, those laws won't explain its actuality without the further presence of the right initial conditions. These are specific conditions of the primordial state of our universe, which, given its general laws, will lead to the formation of molecules, galaxies, organisms, consciousness, and intelligence. My hypothesis is only that the laws are such as to make not only the first, but the last of these developments intelligible, given the initial conditions which lead to the development of some organisms or other. An evolutionary explanation of human reason is endorsed in Robert Nozick's recent book, The Nature of Rationality. What he says belongs to the genre of naturalized epistemology, but he uses the evolutionary hypothesis to explain certain limitations on reason as well as its successes. He proposes a reversal of the Kantian dependence of the facts on reason, namely, quote, that it is reason that is the dependent variable, shaped by the facts, and its dependence upon the facts explains the correlation and correspondence between them. It is just such an alternative that our evolutionary hypothesis presents, his evolutionary hypothesis. Reason tells us about reality because reality shapes reason, selecting for what seems evident. End of quote. Though its full development is extremely interesting, I won't be concerned with the details of Nozick's hypothesis, only with its status. Here is his meta-comment, quote, the evolutionary explanation itself is something we arrive at, in part, by the use of reason to support evolutionary theory in general and also this particular application of it. Hence, it does not provide a reason-independent justification of reason, and although it grounds reason in facts independent of reason, this grounding is not accepted by us independently of our reason. Hence, the account is not part of first philosophy. It is part of our current ongoing scientific view, end quote. Nozick is operating here with an idea of the facts and reality as being what they are independently of what we think, and I shall follow him in this. He insists that our finding something self-evident is no guarantee that it is necessarily true or true at all, since the disposition to find it self-evident could have been an evolutionary adaptation to its being only approximately and contingently true. The proposal is supposed to be an explanation of reason, but not a justification of it. Although it grounds reason in certain evolutionary facts, this is a causal grounding only. Those facts are not supposed to provide us with grounds for accepting the validity or reliability of reason. So the explanation is not circular. But what is it intended to provide? It seems to be a proposal of a possible naturalistic explanation of the existence of reason, which would, if it were true, make our reliance on reason objectively reasonable, that is, a reliable way of getting at the truth, allowing for the equally important function of reason in correcting and improving its own methods. But is the hypothesis really compatible with continued confidence in reason as a source of knowledge about the non-apparent character of the world? In itself, I believe an evolutionary story tells against such confidence. Without something more, the idea that our rational capacity was the product of natural selection would render reasoning far less trustworthy than Nozick suggests, beyond its original coping functions. There would be no reason to trust its results in mathematics and science, for example. And insofar as the evolutionary hypothesis itself depends on reason, it would be self-undermining. Unless it is coupled with an independent basis for confidence in reason, the evolutionary hypothesis is threatening rather than reassuring. It is consistent with continued confidence only if it amounts to the hypothesis that evolution has led to the existence of creatures, namely us, with a capacity for reasoning in whose validity we can have much stronger confidence than would be warranted merely from its having come into existence in that way. I have to be able to believe that the evolutionary explanation is consistent with the proposition that I follow the rules of logic because they are correct, not merely because I am biologically programmed to do so. But to believe that, I have to be justified independently in believing that they are correct. And this I cannot be on the basis merely of my contingent psychological disposition, together with the hypothesis that it is the product of natural selection. I can have no justification for trusting a reasoning capacity I have as a consequence of natural selection unless I am justified in trusting it simply in itself. That is, believing what it tells me in virtue of the content of the arguments it delivers. If reason is in this way self-justifying, then it is open to us also to speculate that natural selection played a role in the evolution and survival of a species that is capable of understanding and engaging in it. But the recognition of logical arguments as independently valid is a precondition of the acceptability of any evolutionary story about the source of that recognition. This means that the evolutionary hypothesis is acceptable only if reason does not need its support. At most, it may show why the existence of reason need not be biologically mysterious. The only form that genuine reasoning can take consists in seeing the validity of the arguments in virtue of what they say. As soon as one tries to step outside of such thoughts, one loses contact with their true content. And one cannot be outside and inside them at the same time. If one thinks in logic, one cannot simultaneously regard those thoughts as mere psychological dispositions, however caused or however biologically grounded. If one decides that some of one's psychological dispositions are, as a contingent matter of fact, reliable methods of reaching the truth, as one may with perception, for example, then in doing so, one must rely on other thoughts that one actually thinks, without regarding them as mere dispositions. One cannot embed all one's reasoning in a psychological theory, including the reasonings that have led to that psychological theory. The epistemological buck must stop somewhere. By this I mean not that there must be some premises that are forever unrevisable, but rather that in any process of reasoning or argument there must be some thoughts that one simply thinks from the inside, rather than thinking of them as biologically programmed dispositions. So my conclusion about an evolutionary explanation of rationality is that it is necessarily incomplete. Even if one believes it, one has to believe in the independent validity of the reasoning that is the result. The reliance we put on our reason implies a belief that even though the existence of human beings and of ourselves in particular is the result of a long sequence of physical and biological accidents, and even though there might never have come to be any intelligent creatures at all, nevertheless, the basic methods of reasoning we employ are not merely human, but belong to a more general category of mind. Human minds now exemplify it, but those same methods and arguments would have to be among the capacities of any species that had evolved to the level of thinking, even if there were no vertebrates and a civilization of mollusks or arthropods ruled the earth. It is natural to look for a way in which our understanding of the world could close over itself by including us and our methods of thought and understanding within its scope. That is what drives the search for naturalistic accounts of reasoning. But it is also clear that this hope cannot be realized because the primary position will always be occupied by our employment of reason and the understanding, and that will be true even when we make reasoning the object of our investigation. So an external understanding of reason has as merely another natural phenomenon, a biological product, for example, is impossible. Reason is whatever we find we must use to understand anything, including itself. And if we try to understand it merely as a natural, biological, or psychological phenomenon, the result will be an account incompatible with our use of it and the understanding of it we have in using it. For I cannot trust a natural process unless I can see why it is reliable, any more than I can trust a mechanical algorithm unless I can see why it is reliable. And to see that, I must rely on reason itself. Once we enter the world for our temporary stay in it, there is no alternative but to try to decide what to believe and how to live. And the only way to do that is by trying to decide what is the case and what is right. Even if we distance ourselves from some of our thoughts and impulses and regard them from outside, the process of trying to place ourselves in the world leads eventually to thoughts that we cannot think of as merely ours. We must, if we think at all, think of ourselves individually and collectively as submitting to the order of reasons rather than creating it. Thank you. But the question is, well, does my position about infinity being implicit in ordinary counting, finite counting, apply to people who only have a rather small finite number of names for numbers and don't have an iterative notation? Of course, someone might not succeed in drawing this conclusion that there are infinitely many distinct numbers, but because it may take a certain imagination and intelligence, but the resources for seeing that that must be the case are already present in your imagined culture, because you could ask the question, if you added 1 to a set which had the highest cardinality that you've got a name for, would that new set have a different number from the original one? And the person would have to say yes if these were numbers. And if he said yes, it would be lots, right? By the way, lots isn't the same as infinity, I mean, right? All of these names are presumably still names of finite numbers. I mean, this lots is a name for any class, finite class larger than the 100, say. But then you'd ask, and what about adding another member to that set, the successor of the original set? Would that be different from the previous one? And so long as he acknowledges, which he has to if he's operating with the concept of number at all, that adding 1 to each set produces a set that is different in number from the original one, you've got him. Well, I do want to, I mean, the question is whether reason can be self-justifying even though it's contingent and doesn't rely on self-evidence. I'd actually distinguish, well, I want to separate the self-justifying character of reason, that is, that it provides grounds internal to this kind of thinking, from Cartesian certainty and self-evidence. It's possible. I don't know if I'm able to put this right, but it seems to me that you can think two things at once. I believe that this follows from this, or that this, I believe that this is a universally valid principle, I may be wrong, that is, I may, if it's complicated enough, be misguided by my rational capacities, but nevertheless, the object of my thought is something that is mind-independently true or false. And this is not simply an expression of my reactions, my point of view, my rational psychology. So I want to separate indubitability from the sort of freestandingness of rationality as a domain. And what it really means is that if you're going to correct something that seems to you a self-evidently valid piece of reasoning, you do it by continuing with the same process. Okay, what Deborah's question was, this is hard. The issue between the person who only recognizes 100 distinct numbers and the person who thinks that there are infinitely many natural numbers is independent of the question whether you regard this as a matter of difference in subjective point of view or not. You can say, no, these are both objective views, but it may be difficult to decide between them. The difficulty is, I think that John Dupre's introduction of the example was intended to support the idea that these things are culturally relative. I mean, it was supposed to be an example where at least it was supposed to confute my claim that the recognition that there are infinitely many natural numbers is simply unavoidable once you start counting, and that this illustrates, the contact of the human mind with something vastly beyond itself. I don't think, I think that there's a clear right answer to the question how many natural numbers there are, and that if those 100 terms in the Stone Age culture that they use to count anything that they care about counting are numbers, they use it for anything, and maybe they do a little bit of addition and subtraction and so on, then they have all you need to get to the result that there are a lot more of them that they don't have names for, distinct from one another, and in fact, that there is an endless series of them. I just think that that's, so I'm sorry, I think it's not I don't think it's an open question